I'm 22, and my parents have basically turned my life into a business transaction. It started when I was 16, the day they handed me a contract and told me to sign it. They called it a responsibility agreement and said it was about teaching me accountability, curfews, chores, school performance, all that. I didn't think much of it. I was raised to respect them, to follow rules, and I assumed it was just another way for them to monitor me. But I didn't read it. At 18, I realized the mistake. I grew up in a strict household, no sleepovers, no after-school hangouts unless they personally approved, and definitely no dating. School came first, no exceptions. I was used to rules, used to walking on eggshells, used to them controlling everything. But the contract? That was another level. When I turned 18, I found out it didn't just stop, it extended into adulthood. By signing it at 16, I had, according to them, agreed to follow their rules indefinitely. That meant curfews, required financial contributions, and needing their permission for major life decisions. They called it a family stability agreement. I was supposed to go to college, but only their choice of college, and only if I still lived at home. I wasn't allowed to apply for financial aid because, according to them, that would be disrespectful since they had already planned my future. They made it clear, as long as I was their child, I owed them. At 19, I got my first part-time job. I thought this was my step toward independence. It wasn't. The contract stated I had to give them 30% of my paycheck as a household contribution. If I refused, that would be considered a breach of the agreement, and I'd have to reimburse them for every expense they ever spent on me. I asked them if this was legally enforceable. They laughed. The contract is notarized, they said. It's binding. I didn't question it at first, but at 18, I started wondering if it was truly enforceable. When I finally consulted a lawyer, I learned the truth. No contract signed by a minor could legally bind me. The fear didn't vanish immediately, but knowing they had no legal power over me made me realize I could fight back. But then came the bank account monitoring. They had access to my childhood bank account. Anytime I made a deposit, they saw it. If they noticed I wasn't contributing enough, they'd confront me about it. When I mentioned wanting to open a separate account, they shut that idea down immediately. If you're living in this house, you have nothing to hide, my dad said. Dating was another issue. If I wanted to date someone, I needed their approval first. They had to meet the person, decide if they were a good influence, and then I was given a curfew. At 20 years old, I had a 10 p.m. curfew and needed permission before going anywhere overnight. By 21, I had enough. I wanted to move out. I started saving, working extra hours, and looking at apartments. But the moment I brought up leaving, they shut it down. They pulled out the contract again. According to them, I couldn't move out unless I reimbursed them for everything they had ever spent on me. Over $50,000. That included food, school supplies, medical expenses, even the gas money they used to drive me to school. Raising a child isn't free, my mom said. We made sacrifices for you, and this contract ensures you don't just abandon us. If I left without paying, they'd sue me, legally disown me, cut me off completely. I laughed at first. They were bluffing, right? They were just being dramatic. Then my dad pulled out the receipts. Every expense, every grocery bill, every school fee, every dollar they had ever spent. They weren't kidding. At first I felt trapped, but after my lawyer confirmed the contract was unenforceable, I knew the real issue wasn't legality. It was control. They couldn't win in court, but they could still make my life miserable if I didn't leave carefully. My 16-year-old sister was next. My parents were already pressuring her to sign the same contract. She was scared. She saw what was happening to me, and she didn't want the same life. But what choice did she have? If she refused, she'd be ungrateful. If she signed, she'd be trapped. I knew I had to do something, so I turned to Reddit. I posted about my situation, wondering if anyone had advice. I didn't expect much, but within hours the post blew up. People were horrified. Lawyers, financial advisors, even people who had been in similar situations all started commenting. That contract isn't legally enforceable. They're using manipulation tactics. You need to get your documents and leave. The responses were overwhelming. Everyone was telling me the same thing. They're bluffing. They're controlling you. You need to get out. For the first time I realized, maybe they were right. Maybe I could leave, but I had no money. My bank account was monitored. If I tried to withdraw anything significant, they'd see it. If I applied for financial aid, they'd block it. If I made a move without preparation, they'd retaliate. If I wanted out, I had to be smart. And my parents, they weren't going to make it easy. This is just the start. But once I made the decision to leave, things escalated fast. In my next update, I'll talk about the first time I tried to break free. It did not go as planned. The moment my post blew up on Reddit, the responses came flooding in. Thousands of comments, some from lawyers, some from people who had been through similar situations, all saying the same thing. That contract isn't legally enforceable. It didn't matter that it was notarized. I was a minor when I signed it, and no contract had forced me to pay my parents for being raised. A lawyer even chimed in, offering a free consultation. I took them up on it immediately. During the call, they confirmed what I'd already suspected. My parents had no legal claim over me. The contract was meaningless. If they tried to sue me for reimbursement, it wouldn't hold up in court. As long as I got my legal documents, birth certificate, social security card, and anything else important, I could walk away without owing them a cent. With that knowledge, I confronted my parents. I told them I had spoken to a lawyer. I told them the contract wasn't enforceable. I told them I was planning to leave. They barely reacted. My dad sighed, like he was disappointed, and told me that even if the contract wasn't legally binding, it was morally binding. They had spent tens of thousands of dollars raising me, and if I walked away now, it would be an act of betrayal. My mom backed him up, saying that if I had any decency, I would honor the agreement. When I didn't back down, the punishment started. First, they revoked my car privileges. The car was technically in my dad's name, so he took the keys and said I couldn't drive it anymore. Then, I checked my bank account. It was empty. Since it was still a joint account, they had transferred a large portion of my savings, leaving me barely enough to function. They didn't drain it completely, maybe to avoid suspicion or legal trouble, but the message was clear. If I wanted to be independent, they would make it as hard as possible. That night, I got a message from my aunt, my dad's sister. She told me she'd seen my post. She'd known for years that my parents were controlling, but she never realized it had gotten this bad. She offered to help in any way she could. My younger sister also came to me that night. She was scared. She knew she was next. She didn't want to sign the contract, but she felt like she had no choice. Our parents had already started warning her about how much she owed them for raising her. The next day, my dad pulled me aside and told me that if I didn't start contributing financially again, I would be disowned, and not just cut off. They would go through every single childhood expense, tally up the cost, and force me to pay it back. I went back and read the contract again. That's when I saw the fine print. It stated that any breach of the contract required financial reimbursement for damages. In other words, if I didn't follow their rules, they could demand money. It was complete nonsense, but they were serious about it. At that point, I had no choice but to leave. Staying meant letting them keep control over my life. I tried to withdraw money from my bank, but it was too late. They had already frozen the account. That night, I called my best friend. When I explained everything, they immediately offered me a place to stay. I didn't want to impose, but I had no other choice. The only problem, I had no money, no transportation, and no way to take anything big with me. If I wanted to get out, I had to leave quietly and fast. Before I could finalize anything, my dad sat me down again. He didn't yell, he didn't argue. Instead, he gave me the guilt trip of a lifetime. He told me that breaking the contract meant I didn't love my family, that I was abandoning them after everything they had done for me, that I was being selfish, ungrateful, and short-sighted. He told me that family takes care of each other, and that if I walked away, I would regret it for the rest of my life. My mom chimed in saying I had known what I was signing at 16, and that backing out now was a disgrace. I didn't argue. I didn't even respond. I just nodded and acted like I understood. Then, I packed a small bag. I planned to leave that night. My best friend was ready to pick me up, and I was going to take only what I could carry, just enough to get me through a few days until I figured out my next steps. At midnight, I waited until the house was silent. I grabbed my bag, tiptoed toward the front door, and reached for the handle. The moment my fingers touched it, the hallway light flicked on. My dad was standing there. He blocked the door. My mom appeared behind him. They both knew exactly what I was doing. My dad took my bag. My mom took my phone, and they told me to go back to my room. I had no car, no money, no phone, and no way out. For the first time, I felt completely trapped. But I wasn't giving up. Not yet. After my first failed attempt to leave, I knew I needed a better plan. My parents had control over my money, my transportation, and even my phone. They thought they had me cornered, but I was already planning my next move. The first thing I did was schedule another consultation with a lawyer. The first one had told me the contract wasn't legally binding, but I needed more than just reassurance. I needed a plan. The second lawyer confirmed the same thing. The contract meant nothing. Since I was a minor when I signed it, it had no legal standing. But there was a new problem. The lawyer advised me to retrieve my legal documents, my birth certificate, social security card, anything I would need to rent an apartment, apply for a new job, or prove my identity. Without those, leaving would be almost impossible. I went home that night knowing I had to move fast. But my parents were already one step ahead. Somehow, they had found out I was seeking legal help. Maybe they had seen my internet search history. Maybe my younger sister had accidentally let something slip, or maybe they were just paranoid enough to assume the worst. Either way, they confronted me the next morning. They told me that if I left, I owed them for everything they ever provided. Food, school, even childhood medical bills. I almost believed them, but after speaking to a lawyer, I realized they were bluffing. No court would enforce it, but they were banking on me being too scared to fight back. My dad pulled out a printed list of expenses. It included everything: hospital bills from when I was born, school supplies from kindergarten, clothes, doctor visits, even food. The total, over $50,000. They said that if I walked away, I owed them that money. and if I refused to pay, they would take legal action. I already knew they had no case, but it didn't matter. This wasn't about money. It was about control. Meanwhile, my younger sister was dealing with her own nightmare. She refused to sign the contract, and the punishment was immediate. My parents took away her phone, cut off her internet access, and started limiting her ability to leave the house. They told her she was being influenced by me, and that she was on thin ice. Later that night, I got another message from my aunt. She had seen my mom's latest Facebook post. It was a long emotional rant about ungrateful children who forget the sacrifices their parents made. It didn't mention me by name, but it was obvious who she was talking about. That wasn't the worst part. My parents had also started calling relatives. They told them I was being brainwashed by bad influences, that I was trying to cut them off for no reason, that I was disrespecting everything they had done for me. Suddenly, family members I barely talked to were reaching out, telling me I was being selfish. Then, they took it a step further. I found out they had called my workplace. They didn't have control over my job, but they knew someone in HR. They told them I was unstable, making bad decisions, and might try to quit without notice. It wasn't enough to get me fired, but it was enough for my manager to ask if everything was okay. That was my breaking point. I went back to Reddit, scrolling through the comments on my original post. A few people suggested calling the police to retrieve my documents. Others told me to set up a new bank account immediately. I took their advice. With my best friend's help, I opened a new private bank account. I had nothing to put in it yet, but it was a start. Then, I started searching for my documents. I checked my room first. Nothing. I searched the kitchen drawers, the office, even the basement. Finally, I found them, locked in a safe in my parents' bedroom. I tried to open it, but of course it was password protected. There was no way I was getting in without a plan. That night, my dad snapped. I don't know if it was because he realized I was slipping away, or if he just wanted to reassert his control, but during an argument, he completely lost it. He screamed that I was selfish, ungrateful, and throwing away my family over nothing, that I would end up broke, alone, and regret everything, that I was being manipulated by people who didn't actually care about me. I didn't argue. I didn't react. I just nodded and walked away. That night, I started packing. I knew now, there was no negotiating, no middle ground. If I didn't leave soon, I never would. The next morning, my mom switched tactics. She became softer, calmer, almost gentle. She told me they didn't want to fight anymore, that they could renegotiate the contract. I agreed, not because I believed her, but because I needed them to think I believed her. I had one chance to do this right, and I wasn't going to waste it. I had made up my mind I was leaving, but I knew from experience that my parents wouldn't make it easy. If I wanted to get out, I had to do it right. The first step was securing a place to stay. My best friend had already offered to take me in, but I needed to confirm everything before making my move. That night, I messaged them from my work phone since my personal one was being monitored. They assured me that I could stay as long as I needed. One problem solved. Next, I reached out to the lawyer one last time. I needed a clear plan. Their advice was simple: get my documents before I leave. Without them, I would have trouble securing a lease, getting a new job, or even proving my identity. They also advised me to gather any important financial information I could access. I couldn't risk tipping off my parents. If they even suspected I was planning something, they would tighten their grip like before. So, I acted normal. I agreed with everything they said. I helped with chores, kept conversations light, and even made an effort to talk about the contract renegotiation as if I was genuinely considering it. It worked. They let their guard down. The next day, my aunt texted me again. She had been keeping an eye on my mom's Facebook meltdown posts and warned me that extended family was starting to take sides. Some were fully on my parents' side, believing I was being manipulated, while others were starting to question how much control my parents had over me. Then she said something that changed everything. She was going to help me financially. She had already put money on a prepaid debit card, $500, enough for food, transportation, and whatever else I needed in case my escape didn't go smoothly. She sent it through the mail to my workplace so my parents wouldn't see it. I finally had a backup plan. With my parents distracted, it was time for the most important part: retrieving my documents. I knew where they were, locked in a safe in my parents' bedroom. The only problem: I had no idea how to open it. I started paying attention. Whenever my dad went into the safe, I stayed nearby. I memorized the button sounds, watched how long it took him to enter the combination, and tried to see the numbers from reflections. Then, I got my break. That afternoon, my parents left to go shopping. They assumed I was still playing along with their plan, so they didn't take extra precautions. The house was empty. I ran straight to the bedroom. The safe was digital with a keypad. I had seen my dad open it a few times and noted the general movement of his hands. When I was home alone, I tried common numbers, birthdays, addresses, their anniversary. After multiple failed attempts, I almost gave up, until I tried their wedding date. The safe clicked open. I moved fast, knowing I wouldn't get another chance. The safe clicked open. Inside, I found my birth certificate, social security card, passport, and a stack of old bank statements. I grabbed everything. Before closing the safe, I took a picture of the remaining contents, just in case I needed proof of what was inside later. Then I shut it carefully to make sure it looked untouched. I stuffed the documents deep inside my backpack, wedging them between my clothes. If my parents searched my bag, I needed to make sure they wouldn't find anything easily. With that, step one was complete, but I wasn't out of the woods yet. That night, I went to check on my car key. My dad still had it. He had been keeping it in his desk drawer, and sure enough, when I went to check, it was gone. I had no way to drive myself out. I immediately messaged my best friend. We adjusted the plan. They would have to pick me up. There was no room for error. We set the escape date for the next night. I packed a small bag, only essentials. If my parents saw me taking too much, they would get suspicious. I went to bed that night, knowing this was it. Tomorrow I was leaving, and there was nothing they could do to stop me. The night of my escape, I played the role perfectly. I kept up appearances at dinner, nodding along as my parents talked about completely normal things, like they hadn't just tried to financially trap me into staying with them forever. I did my chores. I acted cooperative about the contract renegotiation. I even told them I'd think about it some more, just to keep them from getting suspicious. By the time 10 p.m. rolled around, everything was quiet. My parents went to bed thinking they had won. At 1 a.m., I made my move. I didn't risk the front door. That's where I got caught last time. Instead, I snuck out through my bedroom window. It wasn't a huge drop, but I had to be careful not to make noise when I landed. The second I hit the ground, I grabbed my bag and ran. My best friend's car was parked a few houses down, lights off, engine running. I threw my bag in the back and climbed in. The second the door shut, they hit the gas. I didn't look back. For the first time in my life, I was completely free. No curfews, no rules, no contract hanging over my head. Just me, sitting in the passenger seat, driving away from everything that had kept me trapped for years. By the time we made it to my friend's apartment, my hands were still shaking. I sat on their couch, staring at my phone, waiting for the chaos to begin. It didn't take long. By 6 a.m., my phone was flooded with missed calls and texts. My mom had left voicemails, some of them frantic, some of them angry. My dad's messages were short and cold. My younger sister had sent a single text. They know. I blocked my parents immediately. I wasn't going to let them get inside my head. I knew exactly what they were going to try. Guilt, manipulation, gaslighting. I wasn't giving them the chance. A few hours later, I got a call from my aunt. She already knew what had happened. Apparently, my mom had posted a long Facebook rant that morning about ungrateful children who abandon their families for selfish reasons. She didn't mention my name, but it was obvious who she was talking about. People in the comments were divided. Some relatives were fully on their side, saying I had no appreciation for everything they had done for me. Others were asking questions. Why would I leave so suddenly if things were fine? That was when the family interference started. By noon, relatives were calling me. Some just wanted to hear my side of things. Others were angry, telling me I was destroying my parents and that I needed to come home immediately. I ignored them all. Then the legal threats started. At around 3 p.m., an email popped up from my dad. It was long and formal, filled with legal jargon, and claimed that I owed them over $50,000 for my upbringing. If I didn't settle the debt, they would sue me. It was pure bluffing. I knew they had no case, but I forwarded the email to my aunt and lawyer anyway, just in case. Later that night, my younger sister found a way to message me from a friend's phone. She told me my parents were in full meltdown mode. They had spent the entire day calling people, relatives, family friends, even my old teachers. They were trying to control the narrative, making sure everyone saw them as the victims, but not everyone was buying it. My aunt made a public post, subtly calling them out. She didn't say much, just that controlling your children doesn't mean they owe you their lives. That was enough for people to start questioning things. Meanwhile, I focused on getting my life in order. I applied for a new job. I set up a secure bank account with my aunt's help. I made a list of everything I needed to do in the next few weeks. Get a permanent place to live, get a new phone plan, make sure my parents couldn't track me. The next step was fully cutting them out, and judging by the way things were escalating, I had no doubt they were about to get even worse. I thought things would settle down after I left. I was wrong. The morning after my escape, I turned my phone back on to check my messages. 20 missed calls, at least a dozen voicemails, more text than I could count. I played one of the voicemails. At first it was guilt-tripping. How could I do this to my family? Then it escalated to threats. They were going to sue me, disown me, make me regret this. By the time I got to the last voicemail, my dad's tone was ice cold. If I didn't return immediately, they would make sure I had nothing. I blocked their numbers. Then I checked my bank account. It was empty. The account I had grown up using, the one my parents had access to, had been completely drained. Furious, I called the bank, but they told me since it was a joint account, my parents had full access. I asked if I could dispute the withdrawal, but they said I needed proof of financial abuse. It was a lesson learned too late. I should have opened my own account sooner. My dad had taken every last cent. I already expected this, but seeing the balance at $0 still hit hard. The only thing keeping me afloat was the prepaid debit card my aunt had sent. If not for that, I would have had nothing. By midday, my best friend noticed something strange. Their apartment complex had a visitor parking lot. A car had been sitting there for hours. My parents' car. They were watching the building. That was when I called the non-emergency police line. I explained the situation: controlling parents, financial manipulation, attempts to force me back home. They listened, then confirmed my parents had no legal right to track me down. If they tried to force me home or physically stop me from leaving anywhere, it would be considered harassment. That was all I needed to hear. By evening, my parents were still parked outside. They weren't coming to the door, but they were waiting, watching. My lawyer suggested I start documenting everything. If the stalking continued, I could file for a restraining order. That night, I got another message from my younger sister. She had borrowed a friend's phone to contact me. My parents had cut off her internet access and were keeping a tight grip on her. She was barely allowed to leave the house. They were pressuring her to sign the contract. She was scared. She wanted to leave too. I told her to hold on. She wasn't trapped forever. The next morning, my parents started a smear campaign. I got messages from extended family members, former teachers, even an old family friend. My parents were telling everyone I had been brainwashed by bad influences and that I had stolen from them before running away. Some people believed them. Others were suspicious. Then I got an email from my former employer. Apparently, my parents had contacted my old job, warning them that I was unstable and might cause trouble if they ever rehired me. It didn't matter. I had already lined up a new job interview. The next day, I walked into my interview with nothing tying me to my past. No controlling parents, no forced contracts, no financial surveillance. Just me, building my own life. I got the job. That same night, I started looking for a permanent place to live. My best friend had been incredibly supportive, but I couldn't stay on their couch forever. I needed a space of my own, where I wouldn't have to worry about my parents showing up. I was scrolling through rental listings when another message popped up. This time, it was my mom. It was one last manipulation attempt. She told me to come back, apologize, and make things right. That if I admitted I was wrong, they would forgive everything. But if I refused, then to them, I was dead to the family. I didn't even hesitate. I deleted the message and didn't respond. Because for the first time in my life, I was truly free. After my mom's last manipulative message, telling me to apologize or be dead to the family, I expected more drama. But instead, everything went silent. No calls, no texts, no social media meltdowns. For 3 days, my parents completely disappeared. No stalking, no threats, nothing. It wasn't real peace though. It was the calm before the storm. Then my younger sister called me from a friend's phone. She had been grounded indefinitely. No internet, no phone, no socializing. My parents blamed her for supporting my rebellion and were watching her like a hawk. She told me they were angry, but not defeated. They were planning something. I didn't have to wait long to find out what. The next day, I got an unexpected call. It was my uncle, my dad's brother. He told me he had seen my parents' latest round of lies and wanted to hear my side. Apparently, my parents were telling everyone I had stolen from them and owed them $50,000 for my upbringing. They made it seem like I had taken their money, abandoned them without reason, and was refusing to pay them back. Some family members believed it. Others were starting to see through the manipulation. My uncle, he knew exactly who my parents were. He told me that he had always known they were controlling, but he never realized how far they would go. He offered to help me financially if I needed it. I didn't take his money, but knowing that someone in the family actually believed me meant a lot. Meanwhile, my first paycheck came in. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Money that my parents couldn't touch, monitor, or demand a share of. For the first time, I was financially independent. I thought things were finally stabilizing. Then my parents showed up at my best friend's apartment. They pulled into the parking lot and started banging on the door. They weren't here for a conversation. They were angry, demanding, trying to force me back home. My best friend called the police immediately. When the cops arrived, my parents acted like victims. They told the officers that I was not in my right mind and that they were just here to bring me home safely. The police weren't buying it. They asked my parents to leave and warned them that if they showed up again, they could be charged with harassment. My parents had no choice but to drive away. That same night, my mom had a full public meltdown on Facebook. She wrote a long emotional post about raising an ungrateful child who had been brainwashed and turned against their own family. The comments? Divided. Some people sided with her, saying I was selfish and too young to understand sacrifices. Others were asking questions. Why was I running? Why cut off my parents completely, unless something really bad happened? Then my dad sent another legal threat, an email filled with legal jargon, claiming that if I didn't pay them back for my upbringing, they would take me to court for damages. I forwarded the email to my lawyer. His response: "This is empty nonsense. Ignore it." That was when I decided to file for a restraining order. I had the stalking incident, the bank theft, the forced contract, and now police involvement. My lawyer said I had enough evidence to legally keep them away from me. That night, my aunt helped my sister escape. It was just for the weekend. My parents couldn't stop her from visiting family. It gave her a break from the non-stop surveillance. She told me our parents were getting desperate. Their lives were falling apart. Family members were dividing, and they were losing control. Then they tried one last insane move. They called the police, and they reported me as missing. The cops showed up at my best friend's apartment to do a welfare check. I answered the door, showed my ID, told them I left voluntarily. It took 5 minutes for them to dismiss the case. My parents failed. Again, that same night, my sister told me she was making her own escape plan. She wanted out, but she needed to wait until she turned 18. I told her I would be there when she was ready. Finally, after weeks of chaos, I secured my own apartment. No more hiding, no more waiting, no more looking over my shoulder. For the first time in my life, I was completely free. It's been a full year since I walked away. Since then, everything has changed. I have had zero contact with my parents. No texts, no calls, no surprise visits, no guilt-tripping messages, nothing. After the restraining order, they stopped showing up at my best friend's place. After their legal threats failed, they stopped trying to claim I owed them money. It was like they finally realized they had no more control over me. But that didn't mean they stopped trying behind the scenes. I found out from extended family that my parents were struggling financially. Without my household contribution or the control they had over my bank account, my parents started struggling. I had assumed they were financially comfortable, but I started realizing that they had quietly relied on me for years. They weren't destitute, but they had overextended themselves, and without my income, they were forced to downsize their lifestyle. They weren't completely broke, but their lifestyle took a hit. Less shopping, fewer vacations, fewer expensive dinners. They tried to guilt relatives into helping them out, but most of them weren't interested. Meanwhile, my sister was playing the long game. She was still at home, but she had learned to fake compliance. She did what they expected, played along, acted like she was following their rules. But the entire time she was preparing. She got a part-time job and made sure they had no access to her paycheck. She started looking at out-of-state colleges, and whenever she could, she updated me in secret. Then my mom tried one last trick. She reached out to relatives, telling them she just wanted to talk to me. No guilt, no anger, just a mother trying to reconnect. I didn't respond. Then my dad sent an email. It was formatted like a legal document, claiming I was officially cut out of their will. I didn't care. A few weeks later, they made one final attempt at a smear campaign. They started telling family friends that I had stolen from them, abandoned them, and was now brainwashing my sister into leaving too. But this time, no one believed them. My aunt and uncle publicly called them out, exposing everything they had done. The smear campaign collapsed. Meanwhile, my sister's escape plan was nearly complete. She had applied to colleges out of state and had a full plan to get out once she turned 18. I had spent the past year rebuilding my life. I had a secure job, a stable apartment, a life where I didn't have to ask permission to exist. Then the final message came, an email from my dad, long, angry, blaming me for destroying the family. I didn't even read it all. I just deleted it. A few days later, an email from my mom. This one was different. Not angry, not threatening, just desperate. She begged me to come home. I ignored it, because for the first time in my life, I was truly free. Now all that was left was helping my sister escape too. The countdown was on. The countdown was over. On my sister's 18th birthday, my phone rang. One sentence. I'm ready. There was no hesitation. I grabbed my keys, picked up my aunt, and we drove straight to my parents' house. By the time we arrived, she was already outside, standing at the curb with her bag. She had left nothing behind, no keepsakes, no sentimental items, just the essentials. She got into the car, shut the door, and we drove away. For the first few minutes, she didn't say anything. Then she laughed. A real, genuine, free laugh. She was finally out. Within minutes the calls started. Our parents had noticed. First they called her, then me, then my aunt. Over and over again. I didn't answer. Neither did my sister. Then my email notifications exploded. My parents were furious. They were demanding that I return their daughter immediately, that I had corrupted her, that she wasn't old enough to make these kinds of decisions. I ignored every message. That night, my sister moved into my apartment. For the first time in her life, she didn't have to ask permission to exist. She slept in until noon. She went outside without having to check in. She made decisions for herself, and she never looked back. The fallout started almost immediately. At first, my parents tried damage control. They told extended family that my sister had been kidnapped, that she had been brainwashed just like me. But this time, no one believed them. Too many people had seen the truth. Too many people had witnessed their desperation and control. A few weeks later, more relatives cut them off. People who once defended them started distancing themselves without their ability to control the narrative. Their lies collapsed. For years my parents had been financially comfortable, but without my contributions, things started falling apart. They had been living off of us, and now, they had nothing. They tried to guilt trip other family members into helping them. No one did. They were forced to downsize, selling furniture, canceling trips, cutting back on luxuries they once demanded as necessities. And still, they refused to take accountability. Instead of admitting their mistakes, they sent one last manipulative email. They told my sister that they would forgive everything if she just came home. She didn't even open it. She blocked them immediately. That was the last time she ever acknowledged them. Weeks passed. Then one final voicemail arrived. It was my mom, crying. She begged for a second chance. She swore that she missed us. She promised that she was willing to change. I didn't even listen to the whole thing. I deleted it. That night, my sister and I sat in my apartment, just us. No guilt, no control, no fear. For the first time, we could breathe. And for the first time in years, we both cried. Not out of sadness, not out of regret, out of relief. Our aunt had been the only family member who truly stood by us. After everything, she became more than just an aunt. She was a mother figure, a real support system. And unlike our parents, she never demanded anything in return. My mother made one last Facebook rant, a dramatic attention-seeking post about ungrateful children and parents who sacrifice everything, only to be betrayed. No one cared. The comments were barely supportive. People had moved on, and so had we. My sister and I made a promise. No one would ever control us again. We would build our own lives, make our own decisions, and we would never let toxic people dictate our future. A year passed. I had a stable career. My sister was thriving in college. Our parents? A distant memory. They were still struggling, still waiting for us to come back. We never did, and we never would. I blocked my parents for good. No emails, no messages, no guilt trips. Just peace. Because sometimes the best family isn't the one you're born into. It's the one you choose.